Hey guys.
Hello, hello.
Man, I think you have
Hey, can you hear me?
barely.
I
Confirm that you're looking at the. I see the presentation. I think everyone is coming in a little quiet and or breaking up, but I don't know if it's just me.
Everyone's extremely
can I
quiet for me
okay.
as well,
Okay.
except for you,
Okay.
Sarah.
Oh, now
You're
Damiana
loud and
is
clear.
coming
Oh,
in again.
yeah, it's because I added my phone as audio.
Okay.
So I had to do I have learned to join in like for visuals on the computer and for audio in my phone. Otherwise, either I don't even hear the volume and I
Wow.
can't hear even though I have troubleshoot the settings for the sound a lot. It just doesn't work. But this works well. Now I have to use two pieces of equipment to just get
Fun.
through.
Fun times. Excellent.
Yep. But Taylor, can you say something just to test your sound level?
Well, now. Oh, hold on.
You have to mute your computer.
Okay, I have to mute my computer. Okay.
Now you sound
I think
perfect.
now yes. I'm speaking through my phone and listening through my phone and looking through my computer. And you can hear me all right?
Yep. Perfect.
Great. Thank you for the troubleshooting help. And based on experience, these tend to get rushed toward the end, so I will not delay any further. Um, has Shauna joined? I think I see her there.
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Great. So Shauna Clark, as well as a few other people in M&E, Julian Glucroft, and some others have been really helpful with making this a presentation that is very much informed by the process that we go through already to build program logics. So she'll help kick us off with a little bit of context, and then we'll get into some of the suggestions. But for now, let me just say that this is the third of the BUX sections about applying UX. And we have so many questions that come up about, when do user assumptions actually show up in a program? And methodically, what do we do when they happen? So it started as a part of this BUX series, but it's evolved to the larger conversation about how we build program logics. Hence, we've invited M&E. They've created part of this material with us. Um, and I'll hand it over to Shauna to say a little more on that.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. And so just want to say a quick thanks to Taylor for doing an amazing job with this presentation series and giving me the opportunity to set the stage very quickly for all of you. So here, I think we have this cartoon, which many of you have seen, because I know we use it a lot in different M&E presentations. So you're probably familiar with it, right? But it illustrates that we can have a lot of complexity around the things that we're aiming to do on one side, and similarly on the side of the things that we're hoping to achieve. And so it's important, though, to think about the necessary pieces that link what we want to do and what we're hoping to achieve. So, teams often deal with assumptions as part of setting out objectives and outcomes and setting out our project theories of change and project logics. So that means that we make assumptions or sometimes we don't make them. We don't make them, or we don't want to acknowledge them. But the assumptions that we make can be and are intricately linked to us meeting a project objective. So identifying, testing, and designing assumptions is a part of the process and part of being explicit, like in our project logics, about what we plan to do, um, what we are actually doing, and what we want to achieve with our projects. And so, more effectively identifying, testing, and designing assumptions can help us to make sure that those amazing, innovative, tried and true solutions and projects that we come up with align with the problems that we're trying to solve. And that um, identifying our assumptions and doing a better job with that can also help us to try to anticipate or unpack gaps in our project designs. And overall, I would say it can help us to make sure that the pieces of our projects knit together in the way that they should. And I think this is especially important, as Taylor will go on to talk about when it comes to users, behavior change, and the like. And so with that, I will turn it back over to you, Taylor.
Thanks. Well said. So the goals of this session should be to actively discuss how we can improve assumptions. This should not be a one-way conversation. We have programmed in and practiced some Minty polls for participation, and everything we've got here should be considered prompts for reflection. We have more questions than answers when it comes to how do we do this great, and we'll be calling on input. We won't take feedback personally. And at the end of the session, we'll offer a way that we can be in touch to keep this conversation going and talk about how we actualize it on our teams through some good systems. So let's get right into one more piece of background. Shauna.
Thanks again, Taylor. So in this slide, we are sharing it reflects a couple of examples of references to assumptions in the CBA guidance and M&E policy. And it's mainly to highlight the fact that assumptions have an important role in understanding in MCC work, right? In understanding how we aim to meet our project objectives and how we aim to hold ourselves accountable for meeting those objectives. And in particular, on the accountability side, in the monitoring and evaluation policy, when we talk about objectives, one of the ways that we talk about them is around monitoring of objectives as we think about our monitoring and evaluation plans. So these are just some examples to highlight the importance of this conversation and the importance of this thinking that BUX is doing.
Yeah.
Back to you,
And
Taylor.
so, thanks. Sorry.
Go ahead.
the context of this is the screenshot on the left is taken directly from CBA guidelines. The screenshots on the right are taken from the M&E policy. So you can tell that the conversation is there to get us thinking about how do we make good assumptions and then use them. But the guidance leaves a lot to be defined. So now I'm going to plug in a Menti link here, or you can use your phone and scan this QR code 8270. Well, I'm also going to go over to this side to start presentation of Menti. Excellent. And this is the code here, 8270-6634. 6634. All right, so I hope you're looking at this question. In which documents are program logic assumptions formally named? We're going to take about 20 seconds and see what responses come. Okay. M&E plans, followed shortly by the M&E annex to the compact. You would think those would go together. That makes a lot of sense. You can answer multiple. And earlier on in the JDDs and the investment memos. Got it. This is reflecting some things that I've heard, which is that sometimes it changes. In some countries, they're stated earlier. In some countries, they're not stated until particularly the M&E plan. We're not revealing answers now, but this is really helpful to see. Cool. All right, 5 seconds. Next question. Oh gosh, let's see. Next question. How do I go to the next question? Does this work? Who on the team is responsible for defining assumptions? This is the wording that will go into the program logic and any of those documents. Okay. So maybe all technical leads. Yep. Project leads. Seem like they also have preeminence in people's mind. Economists play a really important role here, if they are not the only ones who do. And country team leads, yes. All right. That one got quicker responses. Maybe feel more strongly about it. All right, the next one is an open-ended, so you have a little bit more time. We want to know what you think makes an assumption important to include in a formal program logic. Cool. Whoa, the word critical is in the first 4 answers. Critical to achieving the project objective, the results, success. Has a strong effect on the outcomes. That's interesting. Yep, you have evidence that's important to causal change. I'm really curious about what kind of evidence might give you the sense that it's important. Great. Critical to outcomes. Cool. We're on more or less the same page, although you can definitely argue that these could be interpreted differently. Impact on cost, time, sustainability. I love that. All right, I have questions here, but I'm going to leave this and we will share the results and readout with everyone later. And we will offer our own suggestion as to what the answers are to at least a couple of these. Now I want to get back to the PowerPoint. The short answer ours to when assumptions are formally identified, where, sorry, not when, but where, is that they live in many.
Are you meant to be presenting something? Because I think we lost the PowerPoint.
All right, let me get it back up here. Thanks, Sarah. Share window this thing. And there we are. Okay, so our short answer to question number 1 is that they probably live in all of those places. We would like to argue that we can be, we as MCC and teams especially, clearer about exactly where we're capturing assumptions and exactly where everyone can find them so that we are on the same page. Second, we'll answer a little bit later, but we would agree with anyone who said all technical leads are responsible for contributing to the development of assumptions. And our high-level answer to the third one is it depends. The ideas were all really, really good. I don't think I could disagree with any of them. We're going to share our own for what to consider in terms of what makes something critical, and how to get the team aligned around that. So thank you for joining. Although it's baked into our ethos, like we said a couple of slides ago, we can clarify how they get made, and we can make better assumptions if we understand people's underlying drivers. If you've been to any of our other BUX sessions, you've seen this stat that 85% of compacts and thresholds were found in this meta-analysis, the white paper forthcoming, to have found faulty logic about human behavior. If Mitzi is on the call, she can say more, or maybe she can drop any comments in the note. I don't want to belabor this, just to say that this is a problem that MCC has known about and started addressing. If you look to the right, though, this is a quote cited from a Mozambique evaluation. And I want to say that even though it's very hard to know everything in the beginning, and assumptions will evolve with implementation, the problem compounds in implementation if later you start to realize things, but you stick rigidly to the design. And we take up the topic of how one can be flexible using user-centered methods and implementation in other sessions. But for now, we just want to agree that the best is to try to prevent this as much as possible with as much evidence early on via talking to users. And if there's anything in the chat, I can't see it, I'm moving on. What are assumptions? Just setting a ground definition. This is what we mean by them. We mean that they are hypotheses that, if true, they predict the causal relationships linking our inputs and MCA's inputs to the outputs and outcomes of the investments. Within these, there's a specific set of assumptions about users, any hypotheses about the people who either benefit from, will be using, or will be implementing our programs. So here's some examples. That can be how people are going to behave. It can be what they're going to prefer, prioritize. It can be something really deep, like their core belief about how government functions in their country, or, the role of women in certain areas. It can be their expectations. Do I think that this utility company will deliver for me? And what is that going to mean for whether I pay my bill on time? Big assumptions about unmet needs. I think that's one that everyone here is really familiar with. Doing needs assessment is fairly standard, for good reason. But yes, you can also think through what motivates and drives people, what are their capabilities, and what are the enabling technology and social systems and policies that will make them more capable of taking advantage of our investments. And then, of course, social dynamics, norms and pressures play a lot on how people act. And a lot of times these things go unstated, and we would like to make them more explicit. So by doing so, we stand a lot to gain. Originally, this slide here, which I'm going to go through quickly, I wrote as a way to justify testing UX assumptions specifically. So just the bucket about users. But it applies to any assumptions, really. Like, if users validate program logic, then you reduce the risk of neglecting details as opposed to having gaps, what Shauna alluded to earlier. That gives you better design. It gives you better implementation because look, the team's ready. You've anticipated the obstacles. Maybe you've got some plans B and C contingencies in place. Maybe you know what risks to look out for in a way that you didn't before, to hopefully avoid delays and added costs. And all of these should lead to better results. Ultimately, the services are taken up, habits are adopted, or tools and skills, technology, whatever it is, and the market adjusts in the ways that we want it to in the program logic. So I think I'll spend a very short minute on this. Just when it comes to UX, today we're not talking about UX methods per se. We're talking about how, from a user-centered mindset, you would think through what it means to define an assumption. But then there's all sorts of research and design methods we would draw on. That's about pinpointing people's needs that are critical to project success. So if a project expects anything from people in the world, expects them to start a habit, habits are hard to break and they're hard to make, that expects them to purchase something, we're dealing with poverty populations. Purchasing is difficult, right? There's so many trade-offs. Definitely if it expects an adjustment in behavior, if it expects a choice of people to choose something over another when there are alternatives in the world, this is what market research is all about. Why would you actually ever choose this? Anyway, all of these things, we've got to understand what the challenges are to fulfilling these expectations and what would motivate someone. So here's a thought starter. It's not necessarily a question for discussion because we've got another participation coming up in a second, but you can just think of the projects you're working on. And a really good question to have in mind is, what do they expect of the people that they impact? All right, next. So we're offering 3 simple steps. It's not a strict formula, but this is a way of thinking through what has to happen. The process, how it unrolls, is going to depend on the country team's own process and collaborations. And I'm going to throw in a little 0 step here. So step 0 is knowing who your users are. We don't need to get too much into this today. It's anyone, like we said, who may have a critical influence on the success of a project or who is impacted by it. Just being on the same page about who it is that we're dealing with, great first step. Second, you begin to identify assumptions. And we can go back to the question previously about, what do we expect from people? Those are assumptions if we expect anything. Second, we can test them. And we're going to say that we need to prioritize clarifying and testing assumptions that are both questionable and mission critical. We do not have time to test all assumptions, and it does not make sense to spend time testing them all. Sometimes you have a really well-informed assumption and you can just go forward with it. So we want to think about whether it meets the metrics that deserve to be tested. And thirdly, how do you apply this? This is the designing for, applying the refined assumption to project designs. So how do you incorporate what you now know into maybe the project logic or into the TORs or into due diligence and implementation plans, maybe even into the ERRs? And we will talk through a couple of ways of doing that via some case studies later. Here's a note that I want to share, that of course there is only so much understanding and validation we can get before the start of implementation. We'll do our best, and necessarily we will learn more things once a program is launched. So when you look at 2 and 3 here as steps, I would advise that we think about those as even part of implementation. We would love to do as many as we can during development, but given limited timelines and just given that you learn more when you start experimenting with the program, these don't have to just be siloed off to pre-AF. Okay, so here's our answer to the earlier question about, excuse me, who's responsible. Our take is that technical leads have shared ownership of assumptions as they are framed in the logic model, depending on who is involved with designing a program. But then, how does it break down with the people who are here presenting to you today and with the project lead? So, if the project designers are the ones who know best what's going to make something work technically, um, it falls on you to be the ones largely to identify the assumptions in a causal logic, right? We can't, someone from BUX or, you know, M&E or FIT, we're not going to be able to say what's going to make a road work well and successful. So that's why the project designer is really taking a leadership position there. The M&E lead sort of working with everyone, thinking collaboratively about, so how would we document this? How would we measure this? Track it? What's a priority? Is this going to be something that we can feasibly hold ourselves accountable to throughout the compact? And then where does BUX fall into this? Well, we are ready to advise on any assumptions that have to do with behaviors and users when they should be made explicit because they are critical. And then we can guide research to test them and how valid they are. All right. BUX, however, is going to have very different abilities to advise depending on when we're involved. I think I'll just echo our request to say at any time in development and pre-implementation, implementation, invite us and let's see what we can do and how we can be helpful. But we will be answering different questions depending on when we jump in. So if at the life cycle phase of the constraints analysis and the RCA, what we're focusing on is just understanding the problem we're solving. The question about assumptions we answer here is, how do norms and behaviors actually factor into constraints? Right? You might know a lot about a constraint to growth. There may be so much data that we are drawing on, and it could be easy to identify. But we would love to be able to help unpack anything that is, a social norm that is underlying that, because it might come down the line as something that should be treated in program design. If it's a little later, and this is often really where we get involved when it's at the JDD, IM stage, is clarifying, so what are we going to do? We know these constraints, we've got some concept notes, we've got some ideas, and that's where we'll come in to think about how to unpack what we expect of people. Then, moving on to design, the questions are, great, hopefully we've got some insights into what's expected of people and how likely that is based on the behaviors in the real world. So how do we manipulate a project design or an implementation plan to account for those refined assumptions? Sometimes that involves behavior change activities, not always. Sometimes it's a question of just tailoring the way that we build the project and roll it out to people. And even later on, we can support the MCA to keep drawing on user insight. Assumptions may be made and solidified, and we're not going to necessarily change them, but we can see whether they're holding and get some signals as to, if they're not, what's something that we might want to modify with the contractors and implementing partners. And I'm letting see no comments. I'm going to pause real quick to see if there are questions here before I get into the next slide with a lot of talking. Any questions or reflections on what we've shared so far? Aldrin, yeah.
I'm really, what you're presenting is really resonating with me. The one thing that surprised me here is just the point at which you highlighted supporting MCA, I guess, to design and validate projects, just thinking about when projects get designed and when it is that we're trying to bring in evidence about human behavior. And, ideally, we would want to have a solid sense about what it is that we're doing to inform the investment memo and the compact agreement. So that was the one thing that sort of jumped out at me on this slide, is just like, when are we asking these questions about, evidence and what project design should look like?
Yeah, that's actually a really good call out. I think the question of design and going into even like concept notes, you're right, they start earlier. And it just gets more and more granular into the feasibility studies and the writing of contracts and TORs later. But yeah, I would agree with you that it can start sooner. Damiana.
But I'm just trying to also understand, maybe Taylor, what you were sort of suggesting. Obviously, the earlier, the user experience team gets to work with the team, the better, because you start making sure that you are understanding the right problem, you're addressing the right problem. And but I think what I took it was that the type of questions that you are able to answer, or the type of things you're able to help with, definitely change depending on where you are. So if you are already at that level of pre-feasibility studies, for example, for a road, there's still a little bit of room to design the thing right, but it's a little farther down the road. So every time that this life cycle, or like steps in the life cycle of a program move, the ability to help do the design correctly starts to narrow a little bit. I think that's what, maybe I'm mistaken, but I think that was the point of this thing. But completely agree with Argerin that ideally the design doesn't start a pre-implementation, but at that point when we are getting ready and preparing some studies before the joint design document is put together.
Yeah, well said. Okay. Thanks, guys. Moving on. So I have said that this is iterative, and I have said in other sessions that design thinking and user-centered design is iterative. So should be naming assumptions. You can't know everything from the start, and we would suggest that the team programs in specific moments where you'd revisit initial assumptions. And sometimes that might include new research and testing. So here's a hypothetical example built on a real case and a real compact. Name it if you want, it doesn't matter. So it's about how to start with a broad assumption based on what's possible to achieve. We're not yet saying how we achieve it. We get to that through repeated rounds of questions. So if you start off with, say people are more productive at work and their average incomes will increase. That seems perfectly fair. We assume this is true because desk research says so, right? We've got a reason. What we'd love to ask then is why, or do people even want to be more productive? What makes people feel more productive? When does productivity seem like it's what's happening for them? What limits it, obviously? What income generating opportunities, because that's what we're looking at as the effect we're talking about here, are people seeking? What are they more excited about or less excited about? And at the end of the day, you're more productive at work. That means you have extra time. How do people want to spend extra time? And knowing more about that, you start learning about the demand and the kind of activity that people will really appreciate and take best advantage of. So, okay, maybe we learned here about limitations. And one limitation is electricity. So more electricity at home and office will enable people to work more and longer and more productive hours. Great. We can understand that this is a barrier, but is that all? And I think because this is the case that we're basing it on, sometimes we stop there. And it's an important barrier and a great one to address. But we want to learn more about potential other sort of commingled drivers as well that would lead to productivity. So imagine we observe a few businesses. And this understanding of needs and behaviors, this is really the sweet spot where BUX's research comes in handy. Say we learn that the linchpin is partly electricity, but there's something more about, how the community applies social pressure, about when people decide that it's desirable to work or not, and under what conditions. How do people adapt when they have more electricity? All of these are the kind of questions that we would want to explore. And how do we know how to get to these questions? Maybe we know, or because we heard from earlier user consultations, that these are some hypotheses, right? So we'll know that it's important to learn a little bit more about these behaviors. And perhaps that could lead us to a combined new assumption. If people have electricity and social pressure at work, they will work longer and more productive hours. So we shape our investments to support both of those critical levers. And we won't necessarily get into how do you shape those today, but at least we know that it's an important part of the puzzle. Okay. Now, we've almost got some interaction. The potential number of assumptions is endless and we can't test everything. Let's not. Here is one framework for deciding what's most important to get right through validation. So we can think of it as a suggestion for where to start. Two guiding questions here. Well, first is, how reasonable is it to believe that the assumption is correct? Some things are common knowledge, like I've got an example, users will prefer a cheaper product to a more expensive one. You probably don't need to test that. It makes a lot of sense, but maybe there's something more questionable, like if you raise awareness about a program, people will necessarily enroll. Maybe they will, but do we have proof of that? Could we see an example of it? One. And the second is, of course, how much does the program logic depend on this assumption being true? If it are not true, the program logic might indeed fail. So it could be tangential. So something like people would like a new policy around tax payments. If you implement and enforce this, it might help that people like the new tax policy, but it could still succeed even if they don't particularly love it. It's not always the case that people wanting something is what drives the change. It helps. Or it could be critical to the program design. So say we're wondering if farmers will transport agricultural products on a new goal. On a new road. If the goal is about improving the agricultural value chain and people use the road to get goods to market, and people use the road but not to get goods to market, are we getting the desired outcome? Maybe that the road is there, but serving a totally different purpose for people because they are wanting to use it in a different way. And so you can see this is all trying to lead us to testing for assumptions that are in the right half of the matrix. And I'm going to zoom out now to get to a slide for participation. I know that I just gave some hints, but I'm really, really curious to see in the group's mind, where do these examples fall? So if you can click back into Minty, you have an ability to take these two yellow ones. I think you're seeing my PowerPoint, but I can stop sharing that and share Minty instead. Yep. There we are. And you have this sliding scale where you can choose how mission critical and questionable these two statements are. feeling guilty now that I annotated it before. So please don't be too swayed by my thinking. Cool. Interesting. All right, so the averages seem to be suggesting we believe it's incredibly mission critical that farmers will transport ag products on a new road, if indeed the objective of that project is to support the ag value chain. And it may be pretty safe to assume that it's not all too questionable. Whereas raising awareness about new technology to drive demand, we're not sure. That seems pretty questionable in the upper right quadrant, but maybe less mission critical. So this is the kind of exercise that doesn't necessarily give you an answer, but it would be great to work through with the team and with the MCAs to decide, what do you prioritize in terms of tests? All right. Thanks for playing. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint now and ask if there are any insights or questions before we get into some specifics. Okay. I wish I had more. Great, seeing none, let's move on. And why do you do that, right? So if we update assumptions, imagine we get to a more refined understanding. We would call this an insight, that actually demand for new ag technology isn't driven by raised awareness, but it's driven by two things. Do you see the results firsthand? Like, can you tell that there are better yields? Or can you just buy the materials at a local store? Like, maybe you just don't want to go through the hassle of trying to figure out how to source it somewhere less convenient. This is a short list here of the kind of decisions that should be easier to make in design and to make correctly once we've got these kinds of yellow assumptions. So you know that firsthand better yield results, that tells you what people find compelling. That's the kind of thing that you've got to put in front of them. You also will know something about expectations to set. If people want to see firsthand results, but those results won't be for 2 years, there's a job we have to do around making it clear in the community, that persistence is going to be important. With the being able to buy materials at a store. Okay, great. Now we know our channels that we need to work through. We might need to know something about who to prepare in terms of local vendors and what it means for them to be able to effectively sell things. Do they need to stock new products? Will they need new training? Are they going to need to provide guidance to customers to help them improve the chances of seeing firsthand results and so on? So all of these things, hopefully, they become more predictable. Okay, I'm at 3:40. So unfortunately, I'm going to skip the first case study. As much as I love it, we will share these slides and hopefully it's clear to see what was happening in the thinking and how we might adjust it. But that's a case study about Kosovo natural gas pipeline that didn't actually go forward in implementation. Let's use something that did, which is the Lesotho Health and Horticulture Compact, which is undergoing a lot of changes in implementation right now. So they made some key assumptions around the willingness of youth to farm as a career and the desire of smallholder farmers to work with anchor farmers that bring goods to market. And I know we have a lot of people from that team on the call. I will give them space to add details. I'm just going to skip through to Lesotho. Great. All right. So the good news in this study is that we did an SBC study and we have some findings. The original assumptions, which I think are being updated lately, are that we'll be able to bring in anchor farmer who will organize smallholder farmers to help the transition to high value horticulture. And number two, women will participate in horticulture in higher numbers when recruited. This is a graphic of the program logic in the compact that is publicly available. So much later on, after having developed this, SBC did a study that youth disinterest in farming is actually a barrier to them joining farmers associations. That was one of the findings. It was only one of many barriers and facilitators. How could we have thought through this instead? So I think what we would have done if we were involved at this in the program logic is thinking about assumption one and how complex it actually is. I'm sorry, this is not about the youth, forgive me. The assumption here is about the anchor farmers helping to organize a transition to high value horticulture. Right. So when we talk about complexity here, what I see immediately is that we're talking about two outcomes. We're talking about the transition to high value horticulture, and we're talking about the organization of smallholder farmers. However, these are not explicitly spelled out. And as Lesotho team has moved forward, they found that the second outcome isn't logically flowing from the assumptions. In fact, smallholder farmers have a different and more strained relationship with anchor farmers. So if we had caught something like this and studied it sooner, my argument is that we may have both tested it and changed the design. I just want to pause because both Donna and Mitzi are on this call right now, and you guys have some breaking news about exactly how you've been adjusting to this assumption in real time. So one of you like to speak about how Lesotho is working on this?
Hey Taylor, I will pop in. It's Mitzi. I think I might not know the answer to that question because I was looking at other parts of the logic. But there might be, if Anna's on this call, she has been working intimately with the logic and might have the answer.
Okay. Ginny.
So I don't have Anna would definitely know more about the current status, but just to having probably been responsible for the phrasing of some of these original assumptions, or at least in part, I think an intent was to not necessarily say that it's reasonable to think that this assumption will happen, which I realize is kind of funny, but to call out things that are uncertain, right? And that in order for the causal chain to be realized, this would need to happen. So, for example, women participating more. I think this is a great example of something that really does need to be looked at through the UX lens. And I think that's what at least I was trying to do now like 7 years ago. That seems like a very long time ago, but that, to me, that seemed like a big behavioral assumption. It's sort of like if you build it, they will come. And we needed to understand more about the context for women to enter this sector and what, like, other than just sort of being recruited and having irrigated fields would prevent them from doing so, including sort of less observable things, right? Like just sort of like kind of cultural context and things like that that are harder to suss out and are sort of assumptions when we traditionally do things like build irrigation systems.
Yeah. Also, thank you so much for saying that you were part of this earlier. I hope it goes without saying, but to state it, like, you don't always have time to sit and perfect every little layer of this. I think it's one of the major feedbacks that we've gotten is early in development. One tends to just, you get it on paper and you want to move along. And taking a pause to even think that maybe you want to test something like this and think about what are the social determinants. It's hard but important. So thanks. I'll tell you what I sort of talked through back when this was developed. And I use this as a case study. And it's about how research, if we had employed UX research at the time, how it might have helped. So I believe we might come in and say, we need to break this assumption down into a few component parts. And then we need to, particularly when it comes to the question of how anchor and smallholder farmers work together, we need data around that relationship. We need data around the trust, around sort of the compatibility, around levels of influence. We might even add a way to sort of craft contracts that helps a power imbalance and gives more to smallholder farmers so that they believe that it's more worth their while to take part in a system that involves them with anchor farmers, or maybe protects them against something that they're worried about if they're involved with another player in the system. And I've heard that this is the kind of question that Lesotho has been asking, and that some contractors are working through the types of service delivery models that are beneficiary for both sides lately. So it is an ongoing question. It just is something that we might flag sooner. And the second one is more to your point about women particularly, and youth to participate. What might we have done if we had started studying this sooner? So again, we're identifying the assumptions and then potentially testing them and then designing for them. So what research could do in terms of identifying and testing is we might flag that these two segments, women and youth, have very different needs. And we could test for the differences in their practices and attitudes toward farming. In that case, if what we learn is that youth, for instance, don't necessarily see farming as a career, but they see it as a supplemental thing, and in fact, they move to cities, which is the case in so many countries, we could tailor our recommendations by these target segments. And maybe we would even advise against including youth. We don't know. Oh, I went backwards. But that's the kind of thing we'd like to be able to flag up front. And then here's just what it could look like. Oh, sorry, I don't have, this is saying the same thing. This is a recap of that. Anyone on Lesotho want to help me add more context or more helpful conclusions that you've learned in reality? Otherwise, we'll move on. Okay. So now we genuinely are getting into conclusions. And Shauna had to jump off of this call, unfortunately, for another one, but we've been thinking about concretely, what would it mean to apply some of these ideas on teams? And I'll open up the conversation to any additions to this list, and any thoughts about maybe how you've done this on your teams together and how well it works. One is literally from the start, you could document on any given country team, how are you going to be dividing ownership of creating and finalizing assumptions, so everyone knows what role they have to play and that they have a role to play. Clearly, you could invite us in to help review program logics as they're being developed. You could go systematically through every assumption to decide which ones do we need to test and research early on. Also, again, we can program in specific moments in the same way that we work plan every single thing that we do. We can work plan in, should we go back to those assumptions earlier? We could also consider, how do you monitor evolving assumptions? If they're not indicators, and we're not technically monitoring them in the M&E plan, how are we going to keep track with these? And if they're that important, should they be indicators? And then I've gotten a great suggestion that during implementation, when you're talking about risks, can you use assumptions made earlier on to help support conversations about risks that you see? Or yeah, make them a formal part of understanding what risk level you're dealing with. And I'm just going to leave that slide here and open it up to Q&A or insights, because everyone has been working with these. There we are. Yeah. Damiana.
Taylor, thank you. I really appreciate, I really like a lot these concrete ways on how do we apply this entire sort of, I don't know, like framework to decide when do we need to document, who owns it. It just puts a little bit of process on that. I think from my experience, working on teams, and I acknowledge that I haven't been working on teams for over 4 years, so things might have changed quite a bit. I think that sometimes sort of like, even when technical leads and M&E and others share the assumptions, I think a lot of times the evidence that was brought sometimes was evidence of something working, even from like impact evaluations from other projects, randomized controlled trials, and saying this worked, this was successful doing X, Y, Z. And I think like in those cases, the team is relying on some information, some data, some studies. But I think like what has been in the past, the step that was not taken is saying, and what were the enabling factors, or what was in that specific context. Let's say something was very successful in Uganda, and now I'm trying to apply it to Malawi. So, and well, this was a randomized control trial, so therefore we are just going to believe sort of the thing. So kind of making a decision of what about those contexts was different enough that we need to then sort of dig a little bit more, that is more context specific. Because I do think that the teams have tried to validate their assumptions with studies and evidence that exists out there. I think just that extra step is saying, but does that work in this context? And what are the factors that we really need to test in this particular context?
That makes sense. Yeah, in conversations with folks from every department around this and preparing for this presentation, the gist I get is that it depends. The teams have very different approaches, and exactly what you've said happens. It happens very systematically for some, but not all the time. So I think we're trying to bring it up to talk about what is best practice to do with teams in general. And we'd love other examples about how it has worked well. Anyone has some, or other suggestions about what's a good concrete way to take this into account. Maria Beatrice.
Hello, hi everyone. Thank you so much, Taylor. Great presentation. I was thinking a lot about, this is the discussion focused a lot on the project logic and the assumptions behind it. But I've been thinking a lot also about how we could use this approach in the beneficiary assessment for projects, which is nowadays done in a very rapid, it seems to be done in a very rapid and succinct manner. So maybe this is one of the ways in which we could deepen, our beneficiary assessments, which is one step that is, it happens around the IMC, and I think it's right after, the rate of return of projects. So, but currently it's a very simplified, assessment. I don't know if you have seen those in compact documents, but I would think that this approach would be helpful also for that. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I know that Allison and Brad Cunningham are having similar conversations about how we can think through, user-centered logic and assumptions, even at the level of, thinking about the ERR. So very early on. Right. Carolyn, yeah.
One piece where I've seen kind of variations of how successful it's been, but I think the piece around pre-feasibility studies is really, really critical because at least in my experience, where MCC, and again, I see this on our teams and program development, it is a tough space to be. There's a ton going on, there's huge time pressures, but a lot of times those studies are kind of what is everything in the sector, as opposed to really looking at what are the critical pieces and what are the interdependencies. And we can't, there are certain really great contractors out there that are able to get at that, but a lot of times what you get back is 13 pages of all the things that should be invested in sector X and country Y. But that critical and analytical lens of what is the sequencing that's needed? What are the interdependencies? What are substitutes? What are complements? What are things that are lower hanging fruit? What requires more engagement? That kind of prioritization around the potential universe of interventions, I think is really challenging. And so having some of that built into the scope of work prior to those feasibility studies going out, I think would be hugely useful, and having the lens of the BUX team really looking at that and saying, what are the pieces that even with a quick read, we can say, we think these are critical pieces or where more analysis is needing, and helping to kind of scope those terms of reference and the type of analysis that we get back.
Yeah. Yeah, very good call. Thank you. Thanks for being a BUX cheerleader. I also know that this is just one day or hours worth of thinking, and it's something that a lot of people on this call have spent a lot of time thinking about, including Joelle, including everyone at M&E. So maybe I'll just conclude by saying we want the conversation to continue. Please reach out to us if you'd like to be a part of an ongoing dialogue here, and see what we can do to put these ideas into place. And Joelle, there you go.
Hi, Taylor. Thanks. This is always really great to watch you present. You're really good at it. I wanted to say, I was thinking while we were talking about the example in Lesotho about youth and participation in projects and design. And what came to mind was like this sort of rubbing of investment criteria against each other in a lot of ways. So like in that example, what would happen if you say, okay, well, like we were counting on youth to participate and we were counting on women to participate. Those are two groups that are usually like called out as target groups for like inclusion. And then what if the only viable, you're saying, okay, well, we did some research, we found out that we can't convince those people to participate in this. They're not interested, they're not, it's not conducive to what they want to do. So then what happens at that decision point? How do you preserve the necessary inclusion without basing a project on the participation of a group of people that doesn't want to participate? It seems like at some point in the progression of the compact design, it becomes really difficult to actually like backtrack and completely redesign. So then you're sort of stuck with this, like having to choose between doing a project that is not based on an assumption that will definitely fail and doing a project that's exclusive. And I wonder how many times those like, I don't know, problems where you can't satisfy all the criteria come up, and whether there is an opportunity for BUX engagement very early on to sort of anticipate when those things are going to come about and maybe prevent situations like that from happening too late to the point where they can't be addressed.
I have a very quick take on this. Is a hard question, but it's that you choose your path. If your path is that the type of intervention and change based on so many reasons, government priorities, MCA priorities, is that you want to go into, improvement in a certain sector, in a certain industry, then find out for whom that is most viable and interesting. And see how to limit it to the right target user group that it makes most sense for. If the path you choose instead is not industry or sector based, but based on the community or people that you are trying to empower in a certain way, then turn the question inside out. Don't see how it is that you can sort of marry them with a sector, but see what it is that they are going to be most attracted to, and start from their needs instead of from the needs of the space. Michelle?
Yeah, I just want to add to that just to say that, I mean, MCC's approach is never to just decide that you're going to have involvement of a particular group in any given project and then go and design the project, and then we find out later on that they never wanted to be involved. I mean, the fundamental, we do years of social analysis to understand these things from the very beginning. And in a given project, I mean, a lot of the work that, for example, we've done with utilities in, for example, the water energy sector doesn't have anything to do with women, right? That's not necessarily, there may be a little, there could be something in some cases, but that's not the starting point, right? It's understanding what the objectives of the program are, and then understanding to what extent, who are we attempting to design for what purpose, right? For what objectives? And then how do we do really good social analysis to understand what sort of program design is actually going to work. So it's not like you start with from the beginning with a particular population. It really depends. And so, yeah, and I think that, these are good methodologies and good frameworks to strengthen that work from the beginning. Yeah, so yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Appreciate that. I know that we've gone over time, and everyone is busy with a lot of thoughts this week. Really appreciate you participating, and really excited to keep talking about this more. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Taylor.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you.